But again, my name is Dustin Matocha. I'm with Empower Texans and Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. And if you're not familiar with us, a lot of people in the Capitol like to describe us as agitators and extremists and funded by dark money groups. And that's their way of not liking what we do, which is to hold legislators accountable. And as Daniel was talking about, we do this most effectively with our Fiscal Responsibility Index, and that's where we take key votes that each legislator casts during each legislative session. Now, originally, as scheduled to come and go over what I thought would be our newly released 2013 Fiscal Responsibility Index, but as he mentioned earlier, they're still in special session. And that's thanks to a certain senator from Fort Worth who decided to take a stand against life and kept them around for another month. Now we're holding off on our release because transportation funding is still on the call, and we want to make sure we include any votes they take during this second special session on the index to make sure they're held accountable. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware that there are 95 Republicans in the House, 19 Republicans in the Senate, nearly 2/3 in both chambers. You'd think that that would lead to a swath of conservative reforms. Well, that didn't exactly happen this session. I know you've probably heard every Republican candidate say that they're as conservative as Ronald Reagan. Not quite. I like to describe it as they campaign as conservatives, but they legislate like liberals. There were several common sense conservative reforms that were brought forth by conservative members of both chambers that never moved. One of them was spending limits. Now, there's a little bit of confusion as to how the spending limit works in the state of Texas. There's what's called the LBB spending limit, and the LBB stands for the Legislative Budget Board. And these are the guys that actually crunch the numbers on the budget to make sure things balance, and they're the ones that actually put the budget together and do summaries and analysis and make sure other bills see how much they cost the state or whether they bring money in and how much. And on that board is a group of legislators. And they come together every November before the legislative session and set the LBB spending limit. They're constitutionally required to determine what the rate of population plus inflation growth is. And they have a choice of measurements to determine what that number is. In this session, they settled, I believe, on 10.7% growth from general revenue spent, undedicated general revenue spent last session for the next session. Now that only applies, again, to undedicated general revenue. So if there's a fund source that's dedicated for a particular purpose, such as like the gas tax, federal dollars, or anything else, that doesn't apply to the spending limit. So the overall budget, only a portion of that is constitutionally limited to spending. Now, a few legislators put a more strict constitutional spending limit proposal together and tried to get it through, which would have, a few of them would have specifically stated what that population plus inflation growth number, how that would be calculated, as opposed to just having a group of legislators essentially act like foxes guarding hen houses and determining what that number is. In the House, that didn't even get a hearing. It was proposed early on, filed as legislation even before they had convened in January, yet it didn't even get a hearing. In the Senate, Senator Dan Patrick did get a spending limit bill through, but because of the 2/3 requirement to suspend the rules to get any bills taken to the floor, they never even took a vote on it. It never moved. Another one was zero-based budgeting. This is where you take a particular government agency and say, you're starting from scratch. From this session, you have $0. You get to propose how much you need to spend and what for. Currently, the legislature does what's called baseline budgeting. So if an agency gets $100 last session, you calculate how much of an increase automatically is what you're starting with. So if they got 100 last session, with baseline budgeting, they would come in and get about $110, and it's just an automatic increase. Instead of going through every session and reviewing, is spending absolutely necessary? That never moved either. A few bills proposing to eliminate the franchise tax, those never moved either. There was a particular bill that would have shined more light on government spending. You might have heard the comptroller put together a proposal to add some transparency measures on local ballots. So whenever a local government, either a school board or city or county, would come and ask for a bond proposal, they would then have to include more information about how much of a tax increase this would require, how much debt they're already in. That failed through some procedural technicalities in the House and just ended up not getting through as well. A freshman state representative from Tarrant County had proposed a bill that would have required legislators to disclose any government contracts that they had entered into, either themselves, their spouses, or any business that they own a majority share of. They would have had to put this on their financial disclosures that they send to the Texas Ethics Commission. Now, if you already know a particular legislator has a government contract, or you want to see if a particular local government entity has contracts with legislators, you can already send an open records request. But that's pretty burdensome on a taxpayer to one, know about this and to go through the hassle of trying to go through on a search to find all these things. How simple would it be just for legislators who already know whether they have a contract with the government or not to just put it on their financial statement? That, even though it was originally given a hearing in the State Affairs Committee in the House, I believe as early as the first week in February, if I'm not mistaken, didn't get voted out of committee until 2 or 3 days before the constitutional deadline for the House to pass out House bills and get it over to the Senate. And they used a procedural technicality to kill it by putting it at the end of the calendar, knowing it would die before the deadline to pass it. Now, there are a couple of bad things that didn't happen that is good for taxpayers. One, we didn't expand Medicaid. And that's a whole different discussion as to why Medicaid expansion is a bad deal. But just know the state would have ended up spending billions of dollars in additional money had we agreed to expand Medicaid. Now, Obama and his administration tried to incentivize states to do so by promising that they would pay 100% of this expansion population, is what they called it, for 3 years, and then the federal government would pay 90% of that throughout. But that 10% that the states would have been on the hook for that time period would have cost the state billions of dollars. And I believe it was estimated that Texas would have paid about $85 billion, I think, over the 10 years after the state would start paying. $86 billion in additional spending. It's a good thing that didn't pass. Another thing that didn't pass, fortunately, was a fee hike for vehicle registration bills. That's good because it's actually forcing them to think about how they're spending the money instead of just automatically increasing revenues. And will hopefully force them to actually take a look at some spending reform and address diversions from the gas tax, the motor fuels tax, and take a serious look at dedicating the motor vehicle sales tax to transportation instead of diverting diverting money away into public education and the comptroller's office and the AG's office and DPS. Hopefully that will put a emphasis on real transportation spending reform. Now, what did they do? They did pass. Well, the state had come in to this legislative session with $8 billion of extra money to spend. They had estimated that they would have an increase, obviously, in general revenue. They had even more than what they expected. So even factoring in for baseline spending, they still had $8 billion of general revenue to spend. And that's essentially going into the state's checking account, and you can spend it on anything. Now, they had talked about prioritizing transportation, water, and education. You could have spent the $8 billion on that, but did they? No. Not only did they blow through the $8 billion of extra spending that they had, they still wanted to tap into the Economic Stabilization Fund in order to fund everything they wanted to spend the money on. And one of those was a water infrastructure bank. And what this essentially would have done was make it easier for local governments to finance debt in order to pay for existing water infrastructure. This didn't address any other issues with the marketplace in terms of literally moving the water from where it's in supply to where it's in demand. This just made it easier and created another debt mechanism, a debt creation mechanism. They spent $2 billion out of the rainy day fund on that. Originally, the Senate had even proposed a worse idea than that. They wanted to take $6 billion out of the Economic Stabilization Fund. Mind you, $8 billion of extra money could have easily prioritized from the beginning that they wanted to spend this money on. Still wanted to take $6 billion out of the state savings account and spend this on transportation, water, and public education. Even though we'd already put $4 billion extra into public education from last session already. Fortunately, the House did not find that so easy to swallow, and that idea died over in the House. Something else they've been up to is trying to go on what I call a crusade against the UT Board of Regents. Now, for the first time in recent memory, these Board of Regents are actually looking into how our public universities are spending our tax dollars, seeing what's going on in the ivory towers on these public campuses. And boy, that's upset some legislators who expect these Board of Regents to just be rubber stamps for higher ed administrators. They're even trying to impeach a UT Board of Regent right now, going through the formal process of holding hearings because he's filing too many open records requests, digging around, seeing what's going on, saying he's becoming a burden on the university. You laugh, they think it's serious. Let's talk about the budget. Again, mind you, we had $8 billion of general revenue extra to spend, and they spent it all. We are still funding crony capitalism and corporate welfare, especially the Texas Enterprise Fund, which is the government's way of picking winners and losers in the marketplace and giving it to companies and trying to incentivize them to come to the state and relocate, as opposed to just having a low tax, low regulatory system for anybody to come and start a business here in Texas or relocate their business in Texas. We're still putting millions of dollars into that. We're still paying taxpayer-funded subsidies to Hollywood. There's what's called the Film and Music Marketing Program. And the legislature decided that it's more important to fund Hollywood subsidies in order to incentivize movie makers to come to Texas over teachers and kids. I don't have the official breakdown of what they voted in the House, but I believe it was over 100 votes, which would have included at least over 50 Republicans voted to prohibit funding any type of parental choice program. So very close to a Republican majority in the House voted against school choice. I'm sure you've all heard of C-Scope. Now we, as an organization, haven't really focused so much on some of the educational deficiencies of C-Scope, but we have paid attention to the issues relating to C-Scope around the transparency of it and general good governance of it. Fortunately, they voted to put C-Scope under the review of the State Board of Education as opposed to the TEA. The TEA, the Texas Education Agency, is an unelected bureaucracy. There's no accountability. At least with the State Board of Education, there is accountability. And because of their efforts, C-Scope is no longer going to be the curriculum source for a lot of school districts. The entities that serve as like the administrative arm of C-Scope are called regional service centers. And we're still funding those. There's at least 15, I want to say 18 of them in the state. And they started essentially as warehouses for overhead projectors and other materials for schools and have morphed into curriculum facilitation and you name it in order just to stick around. Now, I believe it was Ronald Reagan that said the closest thing to eternal life you'll ever see on earth is a government bureaucracy. That's regional service centers. And yet we're still funding them as an extra layer of bureaucracy in our school systems. How many of you know that there is a commission on the arts funded with taxpayer dollars? We're still funding that. The House decided that state and taxpayer-funded art was more important than volunteer firefighters. They had a choice. They could have taken the state money in the Commission of the Arts and put that towards volunteer firefighters. They chose taxpayer-funded art. You'll see as well when you review our index that there were many attempts to add new regulations and licensing requirements for various occupations. And a big problem with our licensing system here in the state of Texas is it's not actually protecting the public. It just serves as barriers to entry for new entrants into a marketplace. They're just there to protect incumbents in the industry. One of them that really stood out to me was the interior design industry. And yeah, I say this as somebody who's about to marry an interior designer. It doesn't need to be licensed. Now I understand there's some issues with whether they can knock down a wall and that sort of thing, but even the Sunset Commission, the agency that overviews our licensing requirements and looks over whether a particular government agency should be either reformed or eliminated completely, even the experts for the interior design industry recommended to them we don't need licensing requirements for interior designers. What did the state do? Well, naturally they made more regulations and more licensing requirements for interior designers and made background checks more stringent and increased the licensing requirements. And that's just one example of some industries that the legislature tried to increase licensing and regulations on industries. You may be surprised to know that there was actually a tax increase passed this session. That was on cigarettes. That's probably why you haven't heard too many people get outraged over it. But let me explain why this was a bad policy, even if you're highly against smoking, and I certainly don't endorse smoking either. But a certain couple of big tobacco companies had agreed back several years ago to what's called a tobacco settlement fund. And because there was an ingredient in their particular cigarettes that was allegedly proven to cause harmful health effects for their customers, they agreed on a tax increase to pay for healthcare costs for the state. That wasn't imposed on